Schönen guten Abend. Willkommen am OIP, am Österreichischen Institut für internationale Politik. Welcome. My name is Cengiz Günay. I'm the director of this institute. And we're really glad to have this event taking place today with such a high-level participants on the panel. Thank you, Loic, for putting this great panel together in such a short time. It was really a challenge, I know. And it's great that we can also contribute to the anniversary of the 30th anniversary of the Human Rights Conference in Vienna. This is a highly relevant topic, as we all know, in times of crisis and change, and where the picture is not so bright when it comes to human rights on the global scale. The more it's important to discuss it and also to have publications in that regard. And here again, thank you, Loic, for producing a study that is touching upon the importance of the universality of human rights and the importance of this conference that took place 30 years ago. This is also a topic that is close to our heart, of course, as an institute. Our institute was established we are going to celebrate next year 45 years of our existence, our 45th anniversary in June, hopefully. So we, as an institute, stand for values such as, of course, human rights, diversity, and democracy. And this has become almost a political message in our time. So thank you for joining us tonight, this evening. It's not night yet, but it feels like. Thank you for joining us. And thank you again, Loic, and all the participants for being here. And I'm looking forward to a great discussion. Unfortunately, I won't be able to listen to it live because I have teaching at university, but luckily we have recording and I will be able to watch it afterwards. Thank you so much. Welcome again. And I know that afterwards there's a little surprise for you behind these closed doors, some refreshments and food. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cengiz. Thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, excellencies. It's my pleasure to welcome you today after my director at this event dedicated to human rights in a multi-aligned world, how to counter challenging narratives and restore universalism. And this event takes place in this important year for Austria, this Vienna plus 30 anniversary. You see the beautiful and colorful logo of the Vienna plus 30, this human rights year. And Ambassador Buczek will tell us more about this commemoration. We have three distinguished panelists with us. Mrs. Dunja Mijatovic is the Council of Europe Commissioner for Human Rights. Mrs. Mijatovic was elected to this eminent position by the Council of Europe Parliamentary Assembly in 2018. And before that, she was the OSCE representative on freedom of the media. I had actually the chance to work a bit with her when I was myself posted at the OSCE. And she had an impressive career as an expert in human rights, communications and media strategy, and regulatory and media policy, both in her country, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and at the European level. And thank you very much, Mrs. Mijatovic, for being with us today. Mr. Brian Carlson is a research professor of Indo-Pacific Security Studies at the Strategic Studies Institute, U.S. Army War College in Pennsylvania. Before starting this position earlier this year, he was the head of the Global Security Team of the Center for Security Studies, the CSS, in Zurich, in Switzerland. And in a recent piece, Mr. Carlson has masterfully analyzed China and Russia's challenges to the concept of a liberal international order, something which will be at the core of our discussion today. Thank you, Professor Carlson, for joining us today. Mr. Christo Buschek is a programmer and digital security trainer. He's specialized in data-related research for human rights organizations and investigative journalists. His project to investigate the Uyghur camps operated by the Chinese authorities using satellite imagery and architectural expertise was awarded the 2021 Pulitzer Prize. Thank you very much for being here. Our fourth panelist, Mrs. Shalini Randeria, the president and rector of the Central European University here in Vienna, might join us later, but she has a problem, kind of collision of events, and she will make her best to join us later, but I cannot guarantee 100% that she will be able to join. But I will, if she manages to come, I will then introduce her a bit further. Before giving our panelists the floor and delving deeper into our project, I would like to introduce Ambassador Ulrike Buschek, the head of the Human Rights and Minority Affairs Department at the Federal Ministry for European and International Affairs. And a big thank you, Ambassador, because the Federal Ministry for Foreign Affairs was instrumental in having this event managed and done, and also this study done. So gratitude from the UEP to make it possible. And Ambassador Buschek will now provide us with an overview of this Human Rights Year 2023, which her department coordinated. Ambassador, you have the floor, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much. Distinguished Commissioner, distinguished panelists, Excellencies, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. My thanks go to the OEP, in fact, for having accepted our proposal for joining forces to this extremely pertinent topic of universality. And thank you also for organizing this event, in addition to providing us with this study. I would also like to thank you for giving me the opportunity to offer the broader context and the motivation why we set out to doing this, and what in fact we have tried to achieve in this anniversary year. As it was mentioned already, 23 is a particularly significant year in terms of human rights, as there are two milestones to commemorate, at least two. 75 years ago, the Universal Declaration was adopted, and this was basically the recognition of the international community that respect and protection for human rights are the basis of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. And therefore, it was the ground stone, so to say. And we are really having in the run-up these days for this particular anniversary. And then 30 years ago, the Vienna World Conference on Human Rights decided to turn the promise of the declaration, the Universal Declaration, into a more operational reality. After more than 2 years of tough negotiations, the Vienna Declaration and Program of Action became the new fundamental and foundational document for international action in the field of human rights. And I put some copies somewhere because I think it's important to really also study the text and the beauties that are in it. There are really some treasures. And allow me please to just highlight a few elements that are in the text, because I think that there's many people remember the conference, but not necessarily the very important elements that are in there, and one of them, in fact, is what we are going to discuss today. Universality was established through the international community in clarifying that this issue has priority over cultural relativization. The principle of non-interference also relativized by clarifying that the human rights situation in a country is a legitimate concern of the international community. And therefore, whenever we hear arguments about sovereignty and non-interference and so on, the Human Rights Conference actually established the question of legitimate concern. Other areas like the establishment of statements on women's rights are human rights. Indigenous rights and children's rights are also covered in the conference, just to name a few. And very importantly, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights set the new framework for international measures to protect and promote human rights in the entire international system, effectively. So it's very important to remember that all these very, very important elements that are taken for granted today are the result of what happened in Vienna 30 years ago. 30 years later, the assessment is ambivalent. We're in a fundamental phase of geopolitical change. Many positive and substantial institutional developments are increasingly challenged or put into question. We are confronted with war as a means of solving political problems, with increasingly ruthless repression, populist politics, and a decline of trust in institutions, especially political institutions. And all of this brings about a multitude of challenges. To this list, we have to add the global crises of climate change, migratory movements, pandemics, and last but not least at all, technological developments which are challenging, some of them, to human rights, especially artificial intelligence, data protection issues, the spread of disinformation and hate speech, freedom of expression, and the misuse of social networks are just some issues of significant concern today. In view of these challenges, we must recognize that human rights and fundamental freedoms can never be taken for granted. We must constantly fight for them, and now more than ever. Living in peace and security is only possible if people's dignity and rights are respected. And human rights are therefore not only a prevention tool, but also the key to solving many of the global challenges. The anniversary year 2023 therefore provides an excellent opportunity to raise awareness of the most pressing problems and also to further explore the new ways to better protect human rights. The High Commissioner, the Austrian lawyer Volker Türk, some of you probably know, proclaimed the 23 the Year of Human Rights in order to seize this unique opportunity to revitalize the spirit of 48 and 93 through a variety of initiatives. And Austria, in close cooperation with Commissioner Türk, we launched a series of events in this context, and the kickoff was in June, the month where actually the Human Rights Conference took place, where we organized a symposium entitled Our Rights, Our Future, where we tried to bring together significant human rights defenders and give them a voice to provide us with their insight of how we could tackle the current challenges. There was also a meeting of young human rights defenders in order to address the future issues of the world and get their perspective, which is of course crucial for developing ideas about the future. And it was also important, I believe, to bring them together from all regions of the world. It was an extremely good event to network for them and also to bring in the various perspectives, because we do tend to have Eurocentristic approaches, which is normal being in the middle of Europe, but to remember ever so often by having these contacts that things might look different from other angles of the world. As I mentioned, the events in June, it was almost a week of events with the High Commissioner was a kickoff, and after that we used the following months to have a series of cooperations with think tanks, with NGOs, with Our embassies started to develop projects and initiatives. Some of you were present at some. It was really a worldwide effort to bring human rights into people's minds to the extent possible. And today's event is another effort in this regard. As we are now heading towards this anniversary, culminating on commemorative activities on the weekend in Geneva, but also in Vienna, in the Rathaus on the Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, we are trying to maximize the impact we have, reaching out also out of the ministry's walls, good evening, and involve civil society to the extent possible. So again, thanks to the OEP for picking up our request for cooperation and organizing this, providing us with the study, and I look forward very much to hearing more about this extremely important concept of universality, universalism you called it, and how you take it as we find ourselves in this time of disruption and crossroads, and how we should take it from here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. If I may just add a bit on what you said about the World Conference in 1993, it's important to recall that it was indeed the largest gathering on human rights ever at this time. Let me give you a few figures. Representatives of 171 nations and 800 NGOs. So I think it was really the start of the major involvement of the civil society at the time. And all in all, 7,000 participants overall. So it was really a big event. So we had, at the time, we had already this tension between the famous formulation of the Article 1 of the Vienna Declaration adopted by the conference. Let me read it, it's very short. The universal nature of these rights and freedoms is beyond question, but at the same time we had already perceptible from what was still named the Third World and would be now named the Global South. I do not like either of these expressions. We had already tensions which could be summarized in one sentence. Human rights are just part of the ideological legacy of Western civilization, and they do not take cultural diversity into consideration. That was what was already perceptible 30 years ago, and 30 years after, such divergences are still here and further exacerbated by a new kind of emerging trend, the appearance of a new multi-aligned, pluralistic, and decentered world order featuring so-called middle powers such as India, Brazil, South Africa, Saudi Arabia, many others, and a new architecture which the Russian Federation and China might be tempted to maneuver behind the scene. We will probably address this issue in a moment. So it's this fundamental conflict between the ideal goal of universal human rights and the pluralistic way to implement these rights that we try to address in the study you found on your chair. Thank you once again to the Ministry for European and Foreign Affairs. It was, as my director mentioned, it was a bit of a challenge, so please forgive us. There is a few imperfections in the setting and the printing, but we will try to correct all that in a second round of printing. But I think the substance is quite interesting. Without further ado, I will now give the floor to our panelists, and I would ask them, during their initial presentation, we'll have 2 rounds of conversation, but at the beginning I would like to ask them to highlight their perception of the challenges universal human rights face in today's world. Mrs. Mijatovic, would you like to start? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, thank you for bringing me back to Vienna, that I consider also my home, a place where I worked on human rights issues for a very long period of time, and also for making it possible for me to meet with so many dear colleagues and friends. It is indeed, I would say, the reason to celebrate, a reason to remember about this, as you rightly stated, historic gathering that actually led to the creation of the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, led by a dear friend and a colleague, Volker Türk, who I will be meeting next week in Geneva, where we will also continue celebrating, but at the same time remembering many things that we, I think, forgot, or we took it for granted. So I think it's important to remember the past, but we must also resist the temptation of some kind of nostalgia. When this particular declaration, Vienna Declaration, was issued, my hometown, Sarajevo, was entering 14 months of siege that actually led to an ordeal that lasted nearly 4 years. And the once really peaceful city with people living peacefully was being ravaged by the forces of hatred. And at that time, in 1992, 1993, is something that I thought, as a citizen of Sarajevo, will not happen again, that we learned on mistakes, that we established institutions, mechanisms, all of these things that we have at our disposals. It's just there. It's on paper. It has to be implemented. But the question comes, why are we not doing it? Why are we not using it? And why we are again going through a process where social unrest, attacks on human rights defenders, journalists, not to mention war in Ukraine, aggression by Russian Federation, and all these other issues that are actually our reality. So in this process of remembering how leaders at that time had more courage, wisdom, and established these kind of institutions, very similar in a very near period. The office that I'm still leading, the Office of the Commissioner for Human Rights, was also established by the Council of Europe member states. So it was a different time. It was a time where political leaders, political elites, as we call them, had courage, dedication, and also truly believed in multilateralism and universality. And that is something that we were all hoping will continue to be the way forward in Europe and beyond. What we are seeing, and you just mentioned several vulnerable groups that were actually particularly mentioned and protected. Women, marginalized groups, and you just think of women's rights, for example. Where do we stand now? After decades of extreme success, of really pushing for equality, really doing everything in order to introduce reason for the gender equality. Still, in many democratic states, we are looking to such a basic issues like access to sexual and reproductive health and rights. In Europe, in 21st century. And it is actually, I would say, the illness that the current political system in Europe is going through. It is actually pushing away all international achievements, all international agendas, even though when they became members of the international organizations, United Nations, the OSCE, the Council of Europe, they did it voluntarily. Nobody pushed any of the states to become member of the family, as we call sometimes ourselves. And the question is, why is that? Why, this weakness that we are experiencing is, really something that is affecting, first of all, democratic fabric of our societies, the universality, multilateralism, and all these things that actually built, better Europe, better world, and having in mind better future for the future generations. I will be leaving the office of the Commissioner for Human Rights in a few months' time. And there is one thing that really still gives me hope, and that's the youth, young people and children. And this is what I'm telling member states, this is what I'm telling all my colleagues. If we fail on young people, if we fail when we talk to young generations about the importance of human rights, and why this is not just something like, words on paper, why it matters and why it is something we need to continue fighting for, directly, openly, and not really trying to push it away in order to please populists that are present in our societies, people that are actually leaning right in order to really win votes. They are attacking vulnerable and marginalized groups. And in this process, Vienna Conference, the Office of the Commissioner for Human Rights, all these instruments and institutions that we have at our disposals are also at the same time fighting for their survivals. Because attacks are not only on the marginalized group, attacks are also very clear towards the institutions and international organizations. And this is something that I think is extremely dangerous. So in order to stop and to give floor to my fellow panelists and also to engage in discussions, I think what we need to do in this process, we need to harness positive forces, and those positive ones are the ones I'm meeting during my trips. And I use each and every opportunity to pay tribute to human rights defenders, to journalists, to ordinary citizens, people that are actually still holding the torch of human rights very high. I'm talking about people I met in Kiev in May 22, when I visited Bucha, Borodyanka, Irpin, immediately after Russian forces pulled out, leaving atrocities and suffering that I already seen in my home country, but I thought never again. Not to mention what's happening in the Middle East and what are we facing as a society at the moment. So those people are the ones that actually giving me hope that we know which way we want to go. And when it comes to politicians, I have to be very honest with you. I do not believe, even being international official and doing the job of the Commissioner for Human Rights, that there is enough awareness, responsibility, not to mention courage, within, current political forces in Europe, I will stay there, to recognize the threat that is real, and it's, really something that we can feel. People can feel it. There is racism, xenophobia. There are things, that are very much related to the well-being on each and every human being. But what we are seeing also in many places is this sort of apathy, if I can call it like this, when it comes to believing in politics. People do not really rely on promises. that are really just promises before the elections. We can just think of the environment. You know, what did we hear about what the politicians will do before they were elected, and after that there is nothing. So there, you know, I think with the mentioning, you know, the youth and future generations, I will stop and, you know, then we'll continue discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Mijatovic. Thank you for your strong message, which is certainly heard. And thank you for warning us against the temptation of nostalgia. I think you put things in perspective, also recalling the history of your own country. Human rights have always been a fight, also at the time of the World Conference. And sometimes in this kind of commemoration, we tend to forget that before it was also difficult. And I will now give the floor to Brian Carlson. Could you please give us maybe your assessment of the situation of human rights in the world at the moment? Maybe also highlighting your topic of interest, Russia, China. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Loic, and I would like to congratulate you on the publication of the report. I think it's well worth reading and a good overview of these issues, and so I'm very pleased to be here. I recently started my new position at the U.S. Army War College, and so I'm required to say at the beginning that the views that I will express here are my own, and they don't necessarily reflect any official view of the U.S. government or the U.S. Army. Frankly, it's hard to be optimistic these days about the prospects for universal human rights. At the time of the Vienna Conference 30 years ago, there was a sense of optimism that now, in the wake of the Cold War, there was a possibility to strengthen this idea and expand it. Now, the advocates of universal human rights are more in a defensive posture and oriented toward preventing the erosion of human rights norms as they exist now. And so, as Loic indicated, my research focuses on China-Russia relations, and so that's the angle from which I will address these issues tonight. The geopolitical context, of course, matters greatly for the future of human rights, and most of the trends are not positive in this respect. As great power competition intensifies, realpolitik concerns will come to the forefront, and the desire to advance human rights will probably fade into the background somewhat. And China and Russia are mounting a very strong challenge to aspects of the existing international order. And in the case of human rights, they pose an especially strong challenge because this is one area where their objections are the greatest. Now, this shared desire that they have to revise certain aspects of the international order is a major driver of their relationship. They lay this out in great detail in the famous Joint Declaration of February 2022 and in many other documents. And in March of this year, when Xi Jinping visited Moscow, he repeated the comment that he often makes that the world is now seeing changes that haven't been seen in a century, but he added that China and Russia are driving those changes. And so they do pose a strong challenge to international human rights. Formally, they agree with the idea that human rights are universal, but in practice, they offer many opinions that tend to undermine that view. They criticize Western countries for adopting Western-centric notions of human rights and for using their criticism as a geopolitical weapon against them. And then China in particular says that there's an overemphasis on individual rights at the expense of development and the need of the government sometimes to step in and overrule individual rights for the sake of the greater good of society. And so this reasoning acts as a sort of ideological cover for their authoritarian rule and for their own human rights abuses, and for the way that they enable human rights abuses in other countries as well, like North Korea and Iran. So this challenge is very acute. And as the US-China rivalry intensifies, excuse me, and as the confrontation between sort of a bloc of China and Russia on one side and the United States and its allies and partners on the other side, as this takes shape, the United States and liberal democracies will be required in many cases to work with countries that don't necessarily have stellar human rights records themselves, as happened during the Cold War. And of course, this will give rise to accusations of hypocrisy, and double standards. So all of these factors are negative from the standpoint of promoting universal human rights. But I'd like to make a couple of points about the role of human rights in this geopolitical struggle. And the first is that as the US-China competition in particular intensifies, human rights is an important part of what it's all about. It is, of course, a struggle for the future of the international security order, but it's also a struggle in the international normative order. It's about what kind of a world we want to live in. And I was pleased to see in the report that Loic cited the work of David Forsyth, who is a leading scholar of human rights and coincidentally an undergraduate professor of mine at the University of Nebraska from many years ago. And he made the point in one of his works from several years ago that if China becomes the dominant power in the international system, then the position of human rights in the international system will fundamentally change. And that is undoubtedly true. China sees a close connection between domestic order and international order, and it wants to reshape the international order in ways that are conducive to the flourishing of its one-party authoritarian system. And if it succeeds too far in this effort to essentially make the world safe for autocracy, then this will call into question eventually whether the world is safe for democracy. And so this is an important part of the struggle. And in order to uphold the principle of universal human rights and to keep alive the possibility that someday that could become reality, it's crucial that the United States and the liberal democracies maintain their strength in the face of China's rise. But this leads to the second point I'd like to make, which is that fortunately, the call for universal human rights give the liberal democracies an important advantage in this competition with China. Because liberal democracies can argue correctly that over time, the protection of human rights and the call for their universal expansion is more conducive to human flourishing and prosperity than authoritarian rule. And this is a very strong argument that they can use to appeal to countries around the world in the global south and elsewhere. And so we're approaching the 50th anniversary of the publication of The Gulag Archipelago by Solzhenitsyn. And so this is a timely reminder of how that work and calls for international human rights from that era played an important role in undermining the legitimacy of the Soviet system. And so it's important for the liberal democracies to make strong arguments in favor of human rights and to point out the failings of authoritarian countries and for example, to shine a light on the situation in Xinjiang. And so with those 2 points in mind, I would just make a few suggestions for how to address this situation. I think it's extremely important that the liberal democracies address challenges to democracies domestically and strengthen our own human rights record. That's essential for setting a good example. In working with other countries, it's important to try to bring ways to bring pressure on them to improve their human rights. And there are a lot of different strategies that might be appropriate at different times, sometimes quietly working with them behind the scenes rather than publicly lecturing them is a more effective means. In other cases, sanctions or other measures are necessary. But I think it's most important to stand on principle and to resist efforts by China and Russia to change the norms of human rights standards. And so it's important for the United States and other liberal democracies to remain engaged on these issues at the UN and in the UN Human Rights Council. The Trump administration withdrew from the Human Rights Council, and that's understandable because some of the things that happen there can be very frustrating, but that just opens up space for China to come in and expand its own influence. And so it's important to remain engaged and to really try to achieve favorable outcomes there, because China isn't trying to overturn the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but rather it's trying through favorable outcomes in the UN General Assembly and at the Human Rights Council to change the norms of human rights. And so it's very important for the liberal democracies to stand up and resist that and to make strong arguments to countries in the global south and elsewhere to stand on the side of protecting those human rights norms. And so as I say, we're headed into a difficult period. I think there has to be an emphasis on some of the most serious crimes, genocide and war crimes. And as Loic details in the report, there does have to be some understanding that cultural differences have to be taken into account, and there have to be some differences made in the way that human rights are implemented, but there has to be rallying around a core set of principles at the heart of what universal human rights mean. And finally, I'll conclude with a comment that I received from my former professor, David Forsyth, when I emailed him about this the other day. He reminded me of a quote by George Kennan, who was a realist, and he wasn't well known for making human rights a priority in foreign policy, but he did make a comment about foreign policy generally that I think is worth keeping in mind here. He said, it's not like plumbing, where you go in once, you fix a problem, and then you leave. It's more like gardening. It requires constant care and pruning and taking care of the garden. So this is a long-term project. It's a very long-term effort, but I would just say in conclusion that it's important to stand up for principles, even when it's clear that they won't be implemented fully anytime soon. The history of the United States offers a good example of this. In the Declaration of Independence of 1776, that document asserted that all men were created equal and endowed with inalienable rights. And yet, for almost a century after that, slavery continued, and then for another century, there was Jim Crow and segregation. And of course, there are still problems today. But the fact that the principle was enshrined gave a strong argument to people who oppose those injustices. And so that should be the effort, to keep the principles strong with the aim of trying to bring them into fruition over the long term.
Thank you very much, Brian, and thank you for this beautiful symbol of the gardening. We should be gardeners of human rights. And also I take from your presentation the need for our countries and maybe our international organizations as well to be more assertive on the tangible benefits of these human rights and the universalization of human rights. Thank you so much. Christophe Bouchek, I give you the floor. And I find your project so fascinating. Maybe you could start by giving us a kind of overview of what you did. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks a lot for the invitation. Also, thanks for my fellow panelists and for these very inspirational presentations. I'm afraid I will be less inspirational, but I will try to give like a more practical perspective from my day-to-day work. So I was involved with human rights as part of, in the capacity of documentation and investigation of human rights violations. So this is where I'm coming from. So primarily those were violations that happened in a war zone, but also violations that had more genocidal natures. My background is in a field that is called, or that we call, data-driven investigation. It's a rather new thing that we are doing. So what I specifically do day to day is like I build software and I build methods in order to do these kind of investigations, either for my own investigations or for investigations of others. So nowadays I'm very privileged. I can do this work as a journalist at the Spiegel, but actually where I'm coming from is like from the civil society, from human rights organizations. So data-driven investigations are not just using data in order to do the work of investigations, but we're also thinking about like how can we collect data, how can we verify data, and how can we produce data that does not yet exist, and that might enable investigations in the first place, investigations that otherwise would not be possible. Sometimes investigations cannot be done because they're too dangerous to be on the ground. That's a very common thing. Or we don't have access to the scene, to the events. That's also very common. Or what nowadays is like more and more the case is like they're taking place largely in the digital realm. So this type of work started to be very, very prominent, or like more known like during the war in Syria. So this war in Syria was particularly brutal. Whole areas of the country has been systematically destroyed. So, but from my perspective, very pragmatic again, like what made this war also very, very interesting and unique is that this is the first war that has not been documented by a third party, but has been thoroughly narrated and documented from a first person by the people on the ground who were living in Syria and who experienced the war and the totality of the war as their part of their day-to-day life. So what they did was like by using mobile phones, by using the internet and social platforms, they produced masses of data, videos, images, witness testimonies. And we try to preserve this data, and then consequently use it for documentation of human rights violations on a large scale. Just to give you an understanding of like the scale that we're talking here. So the collection grew to like 4 to 5 million videos just about the war in Syria, around equally amount of images, and then an uncountable amount of like messages, mainly from social media platforms. We collected data from 12 different platforms and from over 10,000 different sources. Also, for a big part of this data, we had the only copy. Data, as we know, disappears online, and because we made a copy of the data, we archived it locally, we held this data that no one else had. Back then, when we started doing this work, we, the larger community, naively thought that big data was everything that we needed to get these insights into this investigative work. But we found out that this was just part of the equation. Not only did we have to go big, but we had to go small at the same time. This means that we collected data on a large scale, like everything that we could get our hands on, we tried to get a copy of it. But we also went very deep into like individual pieces of data, single images, single videos, sometimes just one frame of a video. This is what we know today as OSINT, open source intelligence, and I'm pretty sure most of you have already heard of this. This interplay between like the large and the small is what allowed us to work very factual and methodological. And it helped us like to go against this noise that like narratives and disinformation is creating, and this very problematic for our work. The large allows us to show proportions and systematicity of something, whereas the small allows us to understand the details, why it matters, the how, the when, the where, the why, the what. This importance and this interplay of the large and the big is something that I see again and again in my work. And I feel like when we think of data as part of our work, I feel like it's important to jump between these two poles, like to understand that like data works in the large, but data also works very, very much in the small. One of the investigations that also Loic mentioned is like we tried to find the locations of suspected internment camps in Xinjiang in China. We exploited a system of censorship on Baidu maps to serve us as an indicator to tell us like where to look first. Like Xinjiang is very, very huge. We used then satellite imagery as our primary source to verify and identify camps. Again, we had to deal with large amounts of data. The approach that we took basically meant that we divided Xinjiang into 55 million different locations. Of those 55 million locations, 5 million were censored on Baidu maps, an indicator for us that maybe there's something interesting there. We then, in the end, managed through the use of satellite imagery and second channel verification to identify 348 previously unknown locations bearing the hallmarks of prisons or structures of coercions. The large, in this case, the large give us the ability to understand the system and the history behind this regime. But the small give us the individual locations, the differences and commonalities between these camps, the aesthetics of the camps, and also the experiences that people had being detained in these camps. So I tried to tie it back into the larger question of like the universality of human rights in the multi-aligned world. And the thing is, my background, I'm very practical. Like I'm working on projects, and we're trying to produce something that is like tangible for us. But one way that I notice how this multi-aligned world plays out for me in my day-to-day work is this proliferation of these many, many parallel narratives that are always true at the same time or appear to be true at the same time. So we move towards a world where everything is true and therefore nothing is true. I'm not sure if today's wave of ongoing disinformation is the cause or the result of this world that we live in. But it certainly stokes and accelerates the situation we are in. And I think we can very, very much see this in the conflict in Ukraine, but also especially now like the conflict in Gaza. Through disinformation, this tendency is actively exploited, not just by state actors, but also by political parties, and as we now know, also by private or economic entities. again, like for me, from my perspective, where I'm coming from, I feel like we still have this one tool that allows us to tackle this situation. And this is to apply data-driven investigation and this interplay of the large and the small. The best I can think of from my experiences how to protect the universality of human rights is to, first of all, double down on investigative methods. And we do this in order to correct narratives that are out there, like to fix narratives that we know are not right. But it's also about like to support the truth against all forms of narratives and disinformation, wherever they may come from. This is not just like Russian disinformation or Chinese disinformation. We have a lot of disinformation here in Austria. We have it in the European Union. We have it through all levels of society. And I feel like one tactic that helps me is like to uncover and verify many, many small facts. Really like think about the small things. But like if you put the small things together, then you create a larger story, and this larger story is going to be very important moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this experience grounded on the field. I would like to give the panelists a second chance to interact and to react to what the others have said. I would like also to suggest two things, maybe that feel free to react, to bring an aspect that has not been brought before, but I would like also to give you not two questions, but two things that are in my... I have the feeling that today's world is likely to be more economic and less political and ideological than before. I have sometimes the feeling that most countries in Europe, in the rest of the world, are mostly interested in new globalization, in global inequalities, trade, new technologies, raw materials, debt level, and to some extent, for some of them, Ambassador, you mentioned the environment and climate change, but human rights do not seem to be at the top of their to-do list. And I have the feeling that the international community is less ideological than it was before. Do you think this trend might lead to a kind of rejection or at least marginalization of human rights? So that's the first remark I would like to throw in. And the second remark I would like to make, and maybe we can discuss about that, it's this claim from the Global South for having a say. And in the study, I quote the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia at the World Policy Conference of last year. We want to be part of the conversation of international human rights. And what, if any, would you suggest? What could help re-bringing these countries of the Global South into the conversation on universal human rights? I will use the same order, and so Mrs. Mijatovic, would you like to start? Thank you.
Thank you. I will start on your last point on Global South, and it's not just Saudi Arabia. You have many countries that have this, very strong wish to be part of decision-making community when it comes to human rights. But at the same time, they're not ready, and we don't have to go that far. We don't have to go to Global South. Just look at my part of the world, where I come from, the Western Balkans. So we don't have to, go to even different continents in order to see that many would like to be part of the discussion. But in this attempt, they do not wish, most of the time, to comply with this universality and the fact that we need to really see more commitment coming from them when we talk about basic human rights. So I'm not talking about something extraordinary. Let's go to Turkey. Yeah, Turkey is a leader. They want to be a leader, but how we can talk about having a say in the international discussion as long as you have hundreds and thousands of human rights defenders and journalists in prison. So, in these discussions, I agree with you saying that there is a need to do a lot of quiet diplomacy and behind the closed door discussions in order to really see if there is a space for improvement. But what I've seen, and particularly at my time at the OSCE, I worked from 2010 to 2017 as a representative on freedom of the media, and I was focusing on freedom of expression, on freedom of the media. So it was not really broad as the mandate that I have now, but it was actually looking at the safety of journalists, media freedom, and on so many occasions, I heard that 57 participating states of the OSCE, we are democracies. And as the representative, as the official, on numerous occasions, I have witnesses here, I said, no, you are not. As long as you have people in prison, that are revealing the truth, like journalists, like defenders, like activists. So being, willing to be part of on a global discussions takes also, compromise. And here, in my view, there are no compromises when it comes to suffering of people. Compromises can be made on certain, legislation or, different cultures, tradition on certain issues. But on this, I think in general, we failed on so many occasions. And when it comes to the economy, if that's the case, I would say, okay, there are more jobs, we are opening borders, we are doing everything in order for our societies to look better. But the migration is continuing. The attacks on marginalized and vulnerable groups is continuing. And we are still talking about universality, which of course, should never stop. But apart from universality, I think what's under attack is multilateralism. And, when it comes to being at the forefront in defense of human rights, sometimes I see us, international organizations, also be lacking boldness in addressing these issues. And then, we have the Spiegel or others jumping in and telling us what's going on in different places. For example, when it comes to migration, I know the Spiegel and many others, they were following my work in order to give visibility, because I was not able to talk about this because of political issues. So it is, something that in a way, is telling us that we should never give up or give in. But when it comes to talking to the ones that actually suddenly remember, they do not agree with the certain commitments and obligations they have as a part of them being part of international organizations, then we are facing even bigger problems, because being too soft and too diplomatic in these sort of dealings is not really helping. Maybe it's helping trade, but it's not helping people that are living in those countries. Definitely not, because I know, because they told me on so many occasions.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Buček, would you like to retake the floor?
Well, just briefly maybe react to your first point on the economy. Yes, but my feeling is that a lot of people do care about the political aspects, and I would say we already mentioned the gender question, where we face an enormous backlash. And there's nothing economic about that. I mean, there is to some extent, of course. We would argue that, of course, 51% of the world population needs to be participating and so on. But if you look at what's going on, the facts are evident. The question that women are pushed back, pushed, marginalized, are attacked, are violently attacked, especially in the digital world. I mean, it's a purely ideological battle that's happening. That's not much about economic participation there. That's power. That's power and participation and new redistribution of power. That's ultimately at the bottom of the question. And there are a lot of political questions related to religion and faith questions, so that's not terribly economic either. all is interrelated, of course, but very often it's about resources, but also ethnic issues that are related to religious questions and cultural questions. So I do sense that a lot of the questions that we are challenged with today are at least as politically as economically related. To the other question about the Global South, you started actually in a very interesting way, because you said Global South, it used to be called Third World. We're still grappling with the terminology in that regard. And that's an interesting point, I think. We know exactly what is meant, I think, but indeed we don't even know exactly how to best categorize what we're talking about and how to respectfully call the countries that don't feel they're yet part on equal parts on the table. I think it's very difficult to classify them as a whole, because they're extremely heterogeneous, and we have a number of conversations, interesting conversations, say with Latin American countries, with African countries, with Asian countries, where some are rather extreme and where we don't see much agreement on where we want to go and what the world should look like. The elephant in the room would be Iran, for instance, when we had countless meetings where it was extremely frustrating to come to some kind of positive dialogue. Women were executed and so on. Other countries, which are definitely part of the Global South, but we feel that we could probably share 90% of the positions we take in the UN and in the Human Rights Council and work together in a absolutely fantastic and fruitful way, both in Africa, in Asia, and in Latin America. So my hope is that we can capitalize on those positive examples where we say, okay, let's intensify our cooperation and our dialogue and so on, and join forces. I think it's extremely important to join forces and somehow join forces in order to bring those promises that you said to fruition. I think that was very well put, this gardening. Sometimes we hear this metaphor about human rights, a marathon and not a sprint. It's also very, very, I think, descriptive and easy to understand what the difference is between both. So I think, as you said, we shouldn't give up. And yes, there are differences. People are looking at economics, but ultimately it's about standard of life, about well-being, about protection of the individual. And as somebody who is very dear to me in this room would say, nobody likes to be tortured, no matter what culture you are part of. Yeah.
Well, I think the first concern that you mentioned is a real one. China offers a model of authoritarian rule and state capitalism. It used to be called the Beijing Consensus. That is potentially appealing to a lot of countries around the world, especially when China comes in with large amounts of aid and especially investment to build infrastructure without making demands for changes in those countries domestically. And so this is a concern. And of course, China has promoted the Belt and Road Initiative, as well as later initiatives like the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, and the Global Civilization Initiative, based on this model of economic cooperation and not interfering in the domestic affairs of other states and not emphasizing human rights. And so this is a concern. But I think that potentially this might not work on both economic grounds and human rights grounds. One thing we've seen during the Xi Jinping era is that Xi has increased repression domestically. He has clearly prioritized maintaining his own power and the Chinese Communist Party's domestic power, even over economic growth and even over China's national power. And so now we see some of the consequences of that in a slowing Chinese economy, there are potentially some huge problems in the Chinese economy in terms of property bubbles and corruption and environmental problems and so forth. And so those economic problems could come to the fore, and they might reduce China's ability to make these investments overseas. These problems might also make some other countries a bit reluctant to entangle themselves with China economically, because maybe it's not a model that's likely to be successful in the long run. And I think people around the world are also alert to some of the risks on the human rights level of economic entanglement with China. Now, I haven't spent a lot of time in the global south myself, but I did make a trip to Kenya last year, and just anecdotally, just on the level of conversations with everyday people, I think there is a lot of concern about what China's growing influence there means for them. And so it might be appealing to the leaders of a country to invite in Huawei to build the 5G network cheaply and to accept other investment from China. But what are the consequences in terms of domestic surveillance and infringement on human rights? And so I think those are concerns that can certainly be raised. And so both on economic and human rights grounds, this model might not work in the long run. And so this leads to the second part of your question. Again, it is sort of a battle for hearts and minds in the global south. And the liberal democracies need to make these kinds of arguments about the risks of China's approach to try to win that battle. But there is, in some sense, you can never quite square the circle. On the one hand, an international order is only legitimate if most people around the world view it as legitimate. And so you have to take account of different views around the world. But on the other hand, these countries did sign the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They did sign up to the declaration here in Vienna. And so they profess to believe these things about individual liberty, as well as the social and political and economic values that are mentioned. And so it's legitimate for the liberal democracies and supporters of universal human rights to continue to emphasize this message and to try to make it a winning message over time.
So I don't think I'm in a position to speak for the global south or whatever that would actually be, but during my work with the Syrian Archive or with Syria, and also my interactions I had like in Southeast Asia, I always felt like that the people that I talked to or that I had interactions with, like their aspirations or what they wanted from life was not so different than what I wanted on average. So I never worked like with states or anything, like with individuals, with people. I think the main difference is that like my access to resources and my possibilities are much, much larger than theirs was. I think that was the only thing that really separated us actually. My ability to travel freely, that was much more restricted for people in Syria or people like in Indonesia, for example. So I think that's probably one part of the problem or one part of this equation that we have to address. I think for us, like instead of like thinking about like what maybe the global south or whatever it is again would want, I think like for us it's important to actually point the finger on ourselves and think of like where we are. And so for example, I live in Austria, so for me I think it's far more interesting to actually look at like what is the situation in Austria, what are the situation of human rights, different types of human rights in Austria, what is the Austrian government doing within the context of the larger institutions. And I feel like instead of like thinking about like, oh, that like other people not respecting institutions, I think like I look at the Austrian government and sometimes I also think like, well, they might not be respecting the institution as much as we would like them to at times. But there are differences, and I think we have to look at like a case-by-case basis. To the question about like that politics became more economical, I think it became transactional because like there's no picture for the future. Like we don't know how our society, how our way of life, how our politics will look like in 20 years, for example, in 10 years. I think if we don't know how we want it to look like, so therefore like we retreat to just like that we go by day, like we just try to get over this day today, and then we see tomorrow what's going to happen tomorrow. And so I feel like it would be important for us like to actually think about like what is the politics that we want to have, or like what is the world we want to live in. And here, just to come back, I also feel like the only thing that gives me a little bit of optimism are young people, because sometimes I do see like there an idea that like how they want to change their way of life, how they want to live a world. Like we don't have the answers anymore apparently. And so I feel like this is a good thing. And also coming back to this my work, like which is a lot about like narrative building and disinformation and these type of questions. I also feel like with a lot of young people, like they're far more skeptical. Like they're not believing. I mean, it's not always true, but like I feel like anecdotally, I feel like young people are much more likely to be suspicious to what they hear, what they see, and like trust more of like what they know themselves. And I feel like that's a very, very important skill, and we have to develop more of this in this world where like many narratives are happening at the same time.
Thank you very, very much. I would like now to give the floor to the audience to have the chance to feel free to do not feel obliged to stick to the topic of tonight, and also make benefit of the wide experience of our panelists. For example, I would be very much interested to know how, Dunya, you managed to get contact with the Russian civil society despite Russia leaving, having left so maybe you could tell us a bit about that. So feel free to ask any question regarding also the experience of each of the panelists. Please, sir.
I have one thing that comes to my mind after observing for 30 years after the conference development of the human rights concepts, and one critical thing in my feeling is that we have to be credible when we negotiate with countries like China, when we promote human rights concepts as universal. As an example, I work now with testimonies from Uyghurs who have been in the concentration camps. So the view from below, not from up. And they observed that there was a change that the government first used to designate them as thieves to justify human rights violations, and that changed that they are now terrorists. And this justifies any violation of human rights. It suspends any human rights if you call someone a terrorist, even if he is obviously not. And that is, I think, very important. We know where this strategy of justifying torture, for example, by calling someone a terrorist comes from, leading to the suspension of human rights. Yeah, so I think it's very important that also the leaders, like the European Union is fortunately doing it, and I hope also the US, would make clear examples of how human rights are really universal and are non-derogable. That means they cannot suspend it with any justification. And I know US has, I think, not signed the Rome Statute, for example. So I think we have to be credible when we promote human rights in this difficult situation where the terms of human rights are used as political small change, like by China, and manipulated.
Thank you. I suggest we take 2 or 3 questions, and then we give the floor back to the panelists.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I think, of course, at the moment you cannot think or talk about human rights without looking at Gaza. Again, I know it has been some time ago, but still the UN resolution condemning the conflict, what's happening at the beginning after October 8th. And there were a lot of course, Western countries that abstained, and of course Austria and some other European countries not signing the resolution. You know, for the West, human rights are, should be non-negotiable. There's no, I mean, of course the document had some flaws, some juristic flaws, Hamas was not mentioned and so on. But if we really say that it's unconditional human rights, then I mean, how can I understand those votes? Is the question clear?
Thank you. So first, thank you very much to all of the panelist members for the very interesting discussion. Now, reading the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it looks to me that the Article 1 and Article 2 are a bit contradictory. On one side, we speak about human rights for everybody. And then the second article, we begin to divide all the people. Race, religion, human color of the skin, and so on. So it seems to me that there is a sort of big ambiguity in this wording. Because either we speak about universal rights, or human rights, sorry, or we speak about human rights for this community, these people, and that. And if we begin with the declaration itself to differ people from one to another, we fail. So for me, the first failure of the universal human rights is there, in this Article 2 of the declaration. So thank you for your comment.
Would you like to react? Feel free to pick any question or any aspect of a question.
No. Please, you go. Well, just very briefly, because it was obviously directed to me as a government representative, your question on the resolution, the recent resolution on Gaza. The reason we did not co-sponsor it was, or we did not vote for it, was that the fact it was a terrorist attack was not mentioned, and we said so from the very beginning. That was the red line that did not fix it. So as easy as that. Yeah. So. You said Hamas, terrorism is a different story.
Hamas was not mentioned, terrorism was not mentioned, I acknowledge that, but that's exactly my question. Is that where we say, okay, if there are certain terms missing in a resolution, we cannot sign them, even though the main objective of the resolution is human rights should be respected.
Yeah, well, that's what negotiations are all about, that we need to find a common ground and negotiate, and if certain aspects are not mentioned, we do not go along with it. That's what we do all the time in the UN. That's a very basic part of the, I wouldn't call it game, it's a part of real life, but negotiations are like that we have red lines, and that was one of the red lines that was not there. So. I forget. There was another question over there. So, to the China. Just a very quick one. You mentioned the fact that the concentration camps or the forced labor camps are justified with terrorism. That's a very, very difficult line. We also need to find a balance for in Europe, and the problem, of course, is that terrorism at large is given as a justification, and that's not accepted at all. What we try to do in Europe is to have exceptions for, say, human rights or for obligations we have, freedom of expressions, for instance, and delineating that very clearly, which says if we suspend one right, then it has to be proportionate. It has to be for a very specific purpose in time. So it has to be very, very clearly limited to for a particular reason in a particular context. So it's the fact that justifications of security I guess security at large are given in order to suspend particular rights are also there in Europe, but not large scale, not without limit, and not to the extent China would use it.
If I may quickly, I find fascinating this label which serves to circumvent human rights. So you mentioned terrorist, but I found also fascinating this label, a foreign agent used by Russia and now Hungary to categorize, people and to allow. So it's definitely something.
And extremism.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Yes.
anything is
Yeah.
extreme.
Maybe if I could say something also to this, like, I mean, this labeling, in the end, this is also like a way to establish a certain narrative. And the label of a terrorist is a narrative that is like much, much harder for us in the West to dispute because of the history of the war on terror. It's a Western construct and policy. So I think for China to use this label is, of course, like a very smart and tactical move. Like, it makes sense because it makes it much, much harder for anyone like in the US or in Europe to basically say like, well, okay, what are we going to do about this now? So I think, again, like working on narratives is a very, very important thing, and we do live in a world where the actuality of things matter far less than they used to, and actually the story that is told around it gained higher importance or higher traction than it used to. And I feel like that's something weird. I don't think we grasp this reality yet, but like we can see it like in our day-to-day, like how politics are happening, like be it around the policies of COVID or policies of migration, where the actuality of things don't really matter, but it's just like what people feel about it, what they want to believe about it as well. I think that's an interesting observation there, and I don't know what to do about this, so I have no solution, but it's like something that I also grappled, and I remember like in the early 2000s when in Europe like these anti-terrorism laws passed in almost every country. I think in Denmark, the first application of the anti-terrorist law was applied on Greenpeace. So I feel like that's a very telling aspect about it. And just like to mention just a small thing, so I don't feel like I'm seeing the same contradiction that you are seeing there, because I feel like people are equal, but they're not the same. And I feel like that's fine, that's okay. And for me, that's not contradictory in any way. And so I think like in order to be equal, I think it's also very much important to understand where people differ and what different needs of people are. So I feel like these two paragraphs, they're not contradictory. And I feel like policy or actions that want to be sustainable have to accept that fact.
Yeah, well, as I said, the United States and other liberal democracies have to set a good example. And when we fall short on human rights issues, of course, China and Russia and other authoritarian states will use that to justify some of their own actions and to try to undermine the whole project of international human rights. But as you correctly pointed out in this case, there have been some terrorist attacks in China that were carried out by Uyghurs, but that doesn't remotely justify interning 1 million or more people in camps. And so, sorry? Yeah. So liberal democracies need to make that argument and make that distinction clear. On the question on the UN resolution, again, I don't speak for the US government, but I will say that the United States has long tried to defend Israel in the UN because there's a belief that Israel has been unfairly targeted by the UN. It's been the subject, I believe, of far more negative resolutions than any other country. And in this case, the United States supports Israel's right to self-defense, and it points out that Hamas is responsible for many of the civilian casualties because of the way that they put their headquarters and weapons and so forth in civilian areas, which makes some civilian deaths inevitable. So I think that helps to explain, for example, the US position on this. I would say on your point on the Universal Declaration, maybe it's not a contradiction, but there is tension, no doubt. If you look at the Bill of Rights to the US Constitution, all of those rights are individual rights. And when you start framing some rights as individual and some as group rights, that undoubtedly does create tension. And of course, these documents were the product of painstaking negotiations, and so it reflects a sort of consensus of the international community. But it is true that China and Russia, for example, will look at documents like this and say there's too much emphasis on individual rights. There should be more emphasis on other parts of these documents, like the greater good of society and economic development, which in their view sometimes justifies curtailing those individual rights. So there is tension, and that does create a problem.
You wanted to add something?
I will I will not respond to all, but I will just, try to talk about something I really, experienced and I know, and it is related to this notion of labeling people or groups as terrorists or extremists, which is something that started happening quite some time ago. You mentioned foreign agents law, which was actually a moment, a start of the Russian government really going after, not only civil society, but opposition in general. So at a time, I was working at the OSCE, and on several occasions, when I made statements or I had, correspondence with the Russian government, I was told by diplomats, so what are you doing, Dunya? I mean, you are defending terrorists, you are, defending all these extremists, and I'm like, okay, of course, this is not something anybody wants to do, particularly being an international official. But it is, something that many do kind of buy, if I can say so, in order really to say, okay, so we don't care about that person is a terrorist. So what we have, with this notion, we have now all these terrorists in Turkey. We have adoption of the foreign agents law. They are called differently. You mentioned Hungary, but it's also part of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is Republika Srpska entity, which actually copy-paste, the law. Georgia had an attempt to do this. So it's all, going into direction of suppression of critical and dissenting voices in the society. And this is something we really have to strongly oppose. All of us, I mean, the societies all around. It is unacceptable. It goes, further and further, and it really then starts, targeting ordinary citizens. The foreign agent law is something that is also known for being used, particularly also the terrorist notion, in Azerbaijan and in many other places. I recently returned from my Armenia-Azerbaijan trip, and I went to Nagorno-Karabakh, leading the first human rights mission, actually, after 35 years of not being able to travel there. And I was talking to journalists and defenders on both sides, and they were saying, maybe there is a process that is ongoing towards some kind of peace agreement, which is something, of course, that is positive. But at the same time, all, on both sides that are opposing different views related to solution of the conflict are already labeled as foreign agents. So, just look at any conflict or any sort of situation where you have people that are willing to say something, that is absolutely not complying with the government sort of position on certain issues, and you will see it. I'm receiving messages even from people from the countries that are not member states of the Council of Europe. I mean, people from Israel are writing me letters and saying, we cannot say anything against our government. People from India are writing and telling me this, from Iran. So it is really, also something what you were saying. People, ordinary citizens, they want the same as we do. That comes to this position, we are all the same people. But which way and which sort of plans certain governments have in relation to the future of their countries is a big question. And how all this will fit into multilateral, complex situation that we are facing at the moment, and also the universality that needs to be protected, is a big question mark. I think the time will tell, but then again, there are more and more, people that are not accepting, pushing and really putting things under the carpet and not discussing this in open, no matter how sensitive and you know, sometimes even dangerous situation is, because we hear, and I'm really glad that Ambassador Petric is here. I hear so many voices. I'm again going back to my own country and the region I come from. You know, do not expose all those war crimes and you know, glorifying war criminals and denying genocide, because the war will start again. You know, so it's better accept all this, you know, put your head into sand, you know, and we will live, you know, peacefully. There will be no problems, which is, of course, you know, it's not the way it should be. But there is also, you know, this fear that is created, you know, do not talk about this, do not mention it, because again, you know, people will start killing each other, which I do not think is the case.
May I interrupt shortly the Q&A session? Welcome Mrs. Rangaria, the president and rector of the Central European University. And
I was supposed to be here at least an hour ago.
Thank you so much for making it. And would you like to sit, or would you like to? But I would be glad if you could maybe in 2-3 minutes or in 5. No, not at all. You're a part of this panel, so I think it's legitimate, and especially that you made the huge effort to join us tonight.
To the 10th district to the 9th
Yeah.
is a slightly long way.
You
want to sit here to say something?
I don't want to displace you. Oh, I will displace someone.
No.
Of course. Please.
Yes.
You sure? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this was meant the way.
Oh,
I'm so sorry.
no.
Thank you.
I think, do I need a mic? Yeah, please. Oh, you have a little mic. So thank you so much for the invitation, and my apologies once again. So maybe 3 quick points, because I don't know what the discussion was like. So there's nothing I can pick up from the discussion. So maybe everything I'm saying has been said before, in which case you will excuse me. But I first wanted to thank you, not only for the invitation, but to congratulate especially Dr. Simonet for this really excellent report that he's compiled on the state of human rights in multi-aligned world. I think the diagnosis is spot on. It really names all the formidable challenges and the obstacles which we have, especially if we want human rights to be both universal in application and indivisible. So the story starts, of course, for someone like me personally, with the Vienna Declaration here in 1993. Because I was I used to live in Germany those days. So that is the time when the Vienna Declaration, the Beijing Conference, and the Cairo Conference, those are the 3 where I was not only part of the German NGO community, which was women's groups who were trying to get women's rights as a focus, but also especially reproductive rights and reproductive freedom in Cairo. So I come from an activist and academic angle to this entire discussion. The 3 points I wanted to make. One, I think, as your report shows, the contention around human rights already started with the preliminary discussions around the Vienna Declaration. And they have not stopped since. I think the tactics have changed and some new players have come into the field. And as you point out, what is happening is the erosion of the human rights regime from within. And I think this is something we really have to take seriously, because this is very much like the erosion of liberal democracy from within. It's not just external challenges, but a slow and systematic dismantling from within. And the critics are both from the right and from the left. And I think that makes the situation very, very much more complex. I myself have been working more on gender and reproductive rights than on anything else. And the backlash here is very concertedly from the right, and it's very much from what I call soft authoritarian regimes, which are challenging women's rights and reproductive rights, and I take this very, very seriously. I think what I found very compelling in the report were also a lot of your detailed data on some of the Chinese alternatives which are being presented, because I don't think most of us are following them in such great detail. But let me make just 3 quick points on this. I think the one book, if you haven't discussed it, and you will pardon me, I am an academic, is Samuel Moyn's recent book called Not Enough. And I'd like to bring that to your attention, because he says something very interesting when he says we tend to forget that the age of human rights is also an age of the victory of the rich. And what it reminds us is that there is a conjuncture and a conjunction between the ascendancy of human rights and a certain kind of neoliberal politics, as a result of which inequality has grown significantly. So political rights without economic rights have become a huge problem. And I think that's something we need to think about, because the culturalization, the identity politics, the relativization, the complaints, as you, Dr. Simone, point out, cultural imperialism, cultural relativism, are part of the attempt not to talk about the economic cleavages. Because unless those are really addressed, you will not be able to guarantee civic rights, political rights, social rights, and especially gender rights. And I think this is, for me, a point about indivisibility, which is really an important point. The second point I just want to very quickly make, and that is to say, I come from India, as you can probably see. One of the points from the global south very much has been always the hypocrisy of the Western position on human rights, the fact that they have always been very selective. And I think that needs to be addressed, because there is a legitimate grievance there of selectivity and double standards. And I think one has to face up to that. Otherwise, there is very little legitimacy for claiming a moral position on this issue. And I think if you remember Etienne Balibar's very famous essay on the politics of human rights, where he says that the contemporary regime of human rights is entwined with humanitarian rights, and thus ultimately with the ongoing militarization of politics and imperial strategies for policing the world. And I think that's something one really has to think together. The third thing which I just want to mention is, and that's one disagreement a little bit with the way you frame one of the points in your report, and that is, I am very cautious about a binary story of human rights where Austria and Europe has something to teach the rest of the world. This is a narrative which is not going to go down and make friends in the rest of the world, but I think not only is it politically problematic, but it's also historically incorrect. And let me just stop with that. I don't know, we're probably all, most of us are German speakers. I think one of the problems with this narrative is, es verwechselt Genese mit Geltung. That the rights originated in Europe doesn't mean that they are valid only for Europe, because in Europe they didn't fall from heaven or from any Judeo-Christian tradition. All of human rights were the result of a huge, long struggle in Europe against absolute monarchies on the one hand and the Catholic Church on the other hand. So they've always been the result of a struggle, and they will be the result of a struggle everywhere. So I think to say that these are Western values is a problem, because that allows the Chinese or the Iranian government to say, then we are going to go by Chinese values, so human rights with Chinese characteristics or Islamic ones. I think it's very much more important to emphasize the universality by not emphasizing the Westernness, but the fact that they are really about the equal worth, dignity of all human beings. And I think in order to do that, one has to understand that There is nothing intrinsically Western about them, but they have been the result of a political struggle here, and they will be the result of a political struggle elsewhere. So I think this is, for me, always a very complicated story, because especially if we try to support when the Iranian women's movement for democracy stood up, the dilemma was, should we go out and support them or not? And if you support them, you are probably going to delegitimize them, because their regime can point the finger and say, these are all paid stooges of Western imperialism. So this is the real dilemma, how to support the supporters of human rights in Afghanistan, the women who are fighting for women's education, the Iranian women who are standing up for democracy. But if we insist that these are Western values, we really play into the hands of the authoritarian regimes, which are going to use culturalist arguments in order to delegitimize. So I really think what is really important at the moment, with all the backlash that we have, is to emphasize both the universality and the indivisibility. And we can only do it if we say these rights were the product of a global assembly of citizens coming together and crafting these with voices from all over the world. And in very many countries, people have taken these rights into their constitutions. Like India is one of the countries in which collective rights, group rights are enshrined in the constitution much before they are enshrined anywhere else. So they have been, the catalogue of human rights has been expanded in many contexts and countries according to the local context, and these rights need translation into the local idiom for people to really incorporate them and fight for them and struggle for them, but without turning this into a cultural relativist argument. And that's the tightrope that we are walking.
I don't want to, we are running out of time, and I don't want to prevent you from enjoying the buffet, but is there any burning question? We can still prolong the conversation while having the food. I would be myself very much interested to know more about traditional values. I found it extremely, the way the Russian president and other authoritarian regimes promote this concept of traditional values. Should we be afraid of traditional values? But we can prolong, we can maybe, let's talk at the buffet, unless there is any burning, somebody has to leave or...
And he wants us to have 7 and 8 children. We should be very
Exactly. Exactly. Thank you so much, and let's enjoy the food.